Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the final edition of the, I guess, winter-spring 2022 Misinformation Speaker Series, co-sponsored by Northeastern University's new lab and Harvard's Shorenstein Center. I'm Matt Baum. I'm a faculty member at the Kennedy School, affiliated with the Shorenstein Center. Very quickly, before I introduce today's speaker, for those of you that weren't able to join us last week, we had a really terrific session with the US Surgeon General and a series of leading researchers in the healthcare misinformation space. The video from that session is available. I believe you can access it at Northeastern's website, or you can also access it from the Shorenstein Center website. So if you didn't see it, I would encourage you to check it out. It was a terrific session. But today, we're very fortunate to have Briony Swire-Thompson joining us, also from Northeastern University, where she's the director of the Psychology of Misinformation Lab. Her research investigates what drives belief in inaccurate information, why certain individuals are predisposed to refrain from belief change even in the face of good corrective evidence, and how corrections can be designed to minimize impact. She's currently funded by an NIH Pathway to Independence Award from the National Cancer Institute. And today, she's going to be talking to us on memory and belief regression after the correction of misinformation. After she concludes her remarks, we'll have a Q&A session. Please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom right corner of your screen, and then we will turn to those. So, Briony, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. So today I'm going to be talking about, obviously, memory's role in belief regression, but I'm also going to be talking about reliability and backfire effects, as well as discrediting disinformation sources. So I decided to make a bit of a tasting plate, get a bit of like all the things I've been working on recently. It's all to do with correcting misinformation, but you can kind of conceptualize it a little as one is very much participant and individual focused, one is measurement, stimuli focused, and then the final one moving on to source. So first up, belief regression. So often people update their belief extremely well immediately after a correction has been presented. However, the big problem is this doesn't last over time. And this has been shown time and time again through many studies, through many different authors over the last couple of years in particular. And on the right, you can see like a very stylized example where you see belief reducing immediately after a correction has been presented, but it kind of regresses towards these pre-correction levels in a delayed condition. And the delay has been varied dramatically over the years. Some can be like, a week, some are a month, up into 2 years is the longest I've seen. The problem is the vast majority of studies examine belief change immediately after corrections has been presented. So, the reason for why this occurs is very much understudied. And it still remains pretty much a mystery why people are more than happy to, report updating their belief in the short term, but not so happy as time passes. So one of the, I guess, the mechanisms that really jumps out is memory. And it's long been known that memory influences the continued influence effect and belief in misinformation. But the exact association between memory and belief regression is yet to be studied. However, there's some great papers by Dan Gilbert before he moved on to his happiness research, showing that understanding information to be false is more effortful than accepting it to be true. And so this is often associated with other research showing that corrections are processed with what we're calling a false tag. So when people hear vaccines do not cause autism, they're processing this false tag as a contextual detail. Now, one of the big problems with this is that these contextual details take effort to recall, and failures of the recollection could lead to people retrieving the information without the false tag. And so it leads to individuals inadvertently accepting the misinformation to be true. So one of the kind of hints towards this could be the case is that older adults are more prone to belief regression. They have this steeper, they tend to re-believe in the misinformation faster than younger adults. And we know that older adults really do struggle with this element of memory, with this element of recollection. On the flip side, there could be cases where people recall the false tag, so they know it was false. They can remember that you told them that this piece of information was false. However, they could forget other things. For example, they could forget why the misinformation is false. They could forget that there was a reputable source attached to the evidence of why this was false. So people could well still remember this false tag, but still kind of re-believe in the misinformation. So essentially, I'm calling these people these dissenters. So you accurately remember that the misinformation is false, but you still believe in the misinformation. So I was really curious to see whether these people are also responsible for belief regression. One last final piece of the literature before jumping into the actual study is what's called asymmetrical updating. So we often find that belief regression is steeper for misinformation than it is for facts. So people are far more likely to update their belief and have that belief change sustained when facts are affirmed than when misinformation is corrected. And, if this proves to be robust and true, this is actually pretty big if we think that correcting misinformation is really that much harder than affirming facts. Often, however, is that these things are not equated pre-test. So there's often asymmetry already pre-correction, and that could be driving a lot of these effects. And so we haven't yet kind of equated these to begin with, which is really important because it'd be far more difficult to reduce misinformation. If it starts higher, it would create a bunch of unequal scaling effects. So this is something that I also wanted to investigate. So in this study, in this first kind of chunk that I'm presenting, I wanted to investigate the exact association between memory for the correction and belief regression, investigate what is the amount of variance that a memory accounts for in belief regression, the degree to which belief regression occurs due to dissenting, this I know it's false, but I still don't believe you anyway, or forgetting, and then finally whether or not it really is asymmetrical once misinformation and fact are equated pre-test. Okay, so for the method, we had actually 700 people from Prolific and 600 participated in these 2 waves. For our conditions, we had a test-retest control. So these are people that were presented with both the pre and post test, but they don't get any corrections or affirmations. Then our other there were 2 correction conditions. One where we presented the memory block first, where people are asked about, what do you actually remember that we told you were true and false. And another one where we presented the misinformation block first. And this was just to check that they weren't influencing each other. That if you were to, first report your memory for, what you think that we told you was true, that you wouldn't change your answer. And they didn't. So all of the rest of the results that you're going to be seeing are collapsed over these 2. For stimuli, we had 32 items from the study that I'm going to be presenting about backfire effects. So we chose essentially the most reliable items, and I will get into why that's important in the next section. But it was great because we had a total variety of misinformation effects. So essentially, pre-test people just rated how much they believed all items to be true. This is an example, where we of a correction where we told people, look, mercury in vaccines can cause harm. That's false. Here's why. And all of our corrections and affirmations had a reputable source attached as well. So in this case, it's the World Health Organization. And then for the post-test, we got people to re-rate their belief. And then for the memory block, we told them, well, this is now a memory test. Can you remember whether or not we told you these are true and false? And both of these are on a 0 to 10 scale, which makes it, you'll see in the results kind of interesting to analyze. So essentially here you have a timeline, you've got your pre-test, people given corrections, you've got your post-test, then there's a 1 month break, then people are re-invited, and then they're given the second post-test. So we have both an immediate post-test and a 1-month post-test, effectively. And the only difference between the kind of correction condition and the control condition is that the control condition didn't get corrections. Okay, so first up, results of between the association for memory for the correction and belief. So here you have memory on the y-axis. So this is how much people remember the misinformation to be true or false, and then belief is on the x here. And so for the immediate, we find it is a strong correlation, but we're getting these quite big floor effects because everyone's remembering that this is false and believing it to be false. And the delayed, you can see that there's a lot more variation. People are forgetting. However, I mean, in both of these, they're incredibly strong correlations. So these are Spearman correlations here. It doesn't, so it's in the delayed, you've got a correlation of 0.84, which is huge. So I guess straight off the bat, you can tell these are very much related. Also, a quick note that all these people up here, like these are the people that are getting it wrong. These are the people saying, you said that this was true. So that's obviously, there's quite a few of those, as you'll see in the future as well. Okay, so for the second question, the amount of variance that memory accounts for in belief regression. First up, we're seeing a very, very typical kind of data pattern of belief regression. It's incredibly similar to the kind of example I showed. This is, pretty much what we see every time. Here we have plotted both on the control condition on the left and the correction condition on the right. And here you have every single participant. What it makes it interesting is that if belief is reduces, you can see it in the green, and if it increases, it's in blue. So essentially, you can see the control condition has been quite stable, but in the correction condition, it's so robust. Like the vast majority of participants are just like heading, correcting in the immediate, and they are regressing in the delayed. So yeah, it's super robust. How we're actually measuring belief regression, though, is with something called belief regression index. So this is something that we created in order to help us understand the phenomenon. So essentially, it's a very simple equation which takes into account both the amount that belief reduces as well as the amount that rebounds. So it's quite nice because you're actually kind of understanding both of these. And just to give you kind of a brief illustration to tell you how it works, essentially, if a person starts off and end up in the same place, you've got a belief regression index of 1. However, if you're rebounding substantially, you're getting a belief regression index of 0.8. But if you're showing something that's incredibly sustained, or more sustained at least, is 0.25. So that's the way, the lower the number, the more sustained belief change a participant is showing. So essentially what we found is memory at the delayed time point accounted for 52% of the variance in the belief regression index. So again, this is like, they are very, very associated, essentially. This is one of the main takeaways. Okay. Now on to what I think is one of the most interesting questions. Is it due to dissenting or forgetting? So here you can see that we've got like little cubes with the immediate in the on the left and delayed on the right. And here you've got your memory. So these are people that are rating, that are saying that they remember that you said this was true. So that's like a 6 to 10 on the 0 to 10 scale. The unsure are people who are saying, I don't know, and false. These are the people that are getting it right. These are the people that are saying, you said this was false. And what we're really interested in the belief kind of zone is just this part here. So this is just the people that are saying, I still believe this to be true. Now the dissenters would be here because they're believing it to be true, but they think that they correctly assume that you presented it to them as false. And if they are, if belief regression is occurring due to these people, we expect this to increase. But if it's due to normal forgetting, we expect this to increase. So essentially what we find is that the dissenters remain stable. If anything, numerically, at least like reducing in the delayed. But for the people that forget, this is actually almost quadrupling. So what this means is belief regression, as far as we can tell, isn't due to dissenting at all. It is overwhelmingly due to people just forgetting that you said it was false. They think that you said it was true. Okay, on to asymmetrical updating. So here's that kind of example data I presented in the introduction, and how we often both visualize and analyze the data to make it easy for us is we actually flip it around so that you can kind of see visually that this is way more sustained and this drops off way more dramatically. So what we find in the data is we actually find, was there asymmetrical updating? Essentially, yes. But you can also see that in the pretest that they are, again, very much not equated. So in order to investigate whether or not this I guess holds up once items are equated, we Winsorize the items, which means you just pretty much one by one reduce the items until they are equated the pretest, and you can see that the effect is greatly attenuated. Like, it is technically still significant, but I mean, you pretty much have to squint. I can barely even see that the misinformation is a steeper decline than the fact. And the effect size is so small that you really have to wonder how meaningful this is. So I would say that the big takeaway here is if anyone is looking into the difference between misinformation and fact, kind of affirmations and corrections going forward, you have to either make sure that they're equivalent pretest or Winsorize them to make sure that they are effectively the same. Okay, so in conclusion for this little section, the association between belief and memory was very strong. The amount of variance that memory accounts for in belief regression was substantial. Belief regression was far more due to failed memory than people dissenting or failed persuasion, or failed persuasion over time. And there was belief asymmetry, but this is greatly attenuated when the items are equated pretest. So in conclusion, I think this is actually incredibly positive because there's a lot we can do to enhance memory. Memory research is incredibly elaborate, and they've got a lot of tricks and interventions to how to make things more memorable. For example, repeating corrections is going to be an incredibly valuable remedy. And yeah, I think it's going to be incredibly interesting to see how this progresses in the future. I finally wanted to also mention, because it was presented last week, the Carey et al. Paper, which I would highly recommend reading. It shows belief regression cross-culturally, but I have been asked a couple of times why this paper found belief regression to be like total, like it doesn't regress towards the pre-correction levels, it regresses totally. And I thought I'd just give my take to kind of put it all into the context, my research into the context of the broader literature. So as you can see, if they did a belief regression index, it would be essentially 1, they're regressing very much to the same level as controls. And what I think is happening here is that I believe that they have a 1 to 4 scale, and the mean of the pretest is actually incredibly low. So 1 here means that individuals do not believe in the misinformation at all. So it could be just a floor effect that is influencing the finding. But if any of the authors are on the line, love to hear your opinion in the Q&A. Okay, let's see how I'm going for time. Okay, so now I'm moving on to reliability and the backfire effect. So in contrast to the previous study, so that is literally under review very recently, which has popped in for review. This one is just published. So it's, far more, I guess, published 2 months ago, 1 month ago. So essentially a backfire effect is where a correction leads to an individual increasing their belief in the very misconception that you're trying to correct. So it's a phenomenon that has been talked about a bunch in the media. I think in general, it just captures everyone's imagination. I think even for myself, it's literally one of the things that got me into studying misinformation. I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon. And however, the current consensus is, when I began doing the study, while it may occur, it's far from the norm. But I was still very much curious into discovering, well, what are the cases? When does it occur? Can we predict it? Can we better understand the underlying mechanisms of why it happens, even on the off chance that it does? So this is very much a lot of impact in the real world, especially at the time, not so much anymore, but the platforms then were using backfire effect to support why they weren't giving direct corrections to misinformation, which was a big problem because we know corrections are wonderful. Biased, but yeah, they're very effective. And also I had heard multiple cases of fact checkers funding nearly being pulled because the funders were saying, well, if your fact checks are just making people backfire, why bother funding you as an organization? So the two most commonly discussed backfire effects are the worldview backfire effect and the familiarity backfire effect. So they both have very different mechanisms with the same outcome. So the worldview backfire effect happens when people are motivated to defend their worldview. It's said to occur with politicized information, with very emotive information. And also it depends on how important the information is, either to oneself or to their perceived society in general. And it's also assumed, these are just quotes generally from the literature, it's very much assumed to happen when individuals strongly believe in a piece of misinformation. So this is when it's thought to be most likely, when people, strongly connected, with this and they believe in it immensely. By contrast, the familiarity backfire effect is said to occur because simply because the misinformation is repeated within the retraction. So if I were to say listening to Mozart will not make your child more intelligent, just the fact that I've mentioned Mozart and a child's intelligence makes these two things more familiar. And the real problem with familiarity, as I'm sure most of you know, is that people are more likely to assume that familiar information is true. So this is actually called the illusory truth effect. Again, it's incredibly robust. So this is essentially the tendency for this repetition to increase belief. So it's often thought that the illusory truth effect and the familiarity backfire effect are driven by the same psychological mechanisms. Essentially, the only difference between these two effects is the illusory truth effect is repetition like without a correction, and the familiarity backfire effect is like a repetition with a correction. One other kind of prediction that this familiarity backfire effect literature would predict is that novel misinformation is theoretically more susceptible. So this is because you're kind of boosting this from something that no one's ever heard before, boosting the familiarity from zero essentially. So the current study, our aims were to characterize the association between these worldview related characteristics. So we've got personal importance to society and strength of belief, and these familiarity related characteristics. So novelty and the illusory truth effect. And why this was so exciting is you're kind of like, it was a bit more of a mechanistic view. And these are often two sides of a literature that don't talk to each other that much, because the worldview backfire effect literature kind of very much stems from like political science, and familiarity backfire effects really exist in more of the kind of cognitive social psychology world. One other kind of phenomenon or attribute that we really wanted to measure here was reliability. So reliability is essentially the consistency of a measure and the degree to which a test or any measurement really is free from random error or noise. Now, reliability or items with poor reliability in this context can really be two different things from belief in general. It could be that, you know, a measurement is very noisy and not very good at measuring what you're trying to measure, but it could also be that people don't really know where they stand on a topic. People don't really care. You know, often we present people with a scale and we ask people to rate their belief, but you know, if they don't have a belief or if they don't really know, this could make them answer incredibly randomly as well. Like you could be like, you know, what do you think of this? And you're like, I don't know, 3. And then like, you know, on the post test, you could be like, 7. And us as scientists are going, haha, backfire. But it could just be like, you know, people not really minding or answering more randomly than you would expect. So this is something important. I had an inkling that reliability could be a major player here, because in a previous study, it was like a review paper. We examined 31 studies that looked into backfire effects, and there was 72 dependent measures. And we found that 81% of backfire effects were elicited when the experiments used single item measures. So this is pretty much just means someone is asking just one thing, like, what do you think about this? And then, you know, asking again, you know, what do you think about this now? Rather than multi-item measures. And the real problem is that studies that use one item, use single item measures, are notoriously unreliable compared to multi-item measures. So essentially, we performed 2 almost identical studies with kind of 2 different sets of participants. Essentially, study 2 had a larger N of 600 people. And people rated 42 items for belief, how important they thought it was, and how familiar they felt the item was. This time there was a 3-week delay, and the kind of a bigger difference, the biggest difference between this one and the last study is that there was only one post test. So people, you know, rated their belief, they received these corrections, and then there was a post test 3 weeks later, or if they were in the control group, they just didn't get. And this is how we measured reliability, was this retest reliability here with using this 3-week delay. So here's an example of an item. We had a vast range of things that were like very important. We adapted those from the Wood and Porter studies. We had things that were very, very much either novel or not important at all. This is an example of one of them. This is a good example of when stimuli creation can be really fun. We're like, what don't, you know, Americans know about? How about Marmite? So this says, yeah, the black salty spread from the UK is primarily meat-based. This is false. It's made from a yeast extract, so it's technically vegan, vegetarian, one of them. It doesn't have meat either way. So what we found was, here's this fairly typical pattern that you can see. Again, we've got belief here on the y-axis, and essentially corrections, people reducing their belief wonderfully. In the control group, you can see like a slight increase here from the usually truth effect as expected. How we rated backfire though was per item. We essentially created a rate, almost a percentage, of people that increased their belief by more than 2 points. We also replicated it with 1 point, but we thought it was a bit more of a conservative approach. Yeah, how many individuals on an item increased by more than 2 points? 2 points or more. So here you have the first set of results. You've got this backfire rate here. So this is a percentage of people that are backfiring. So you can see it's widely, I mean, you've got up to about 35% of people backfiring on some items, and some items like aren't backfiring at all. And essentially what we found in both studies is that how the test-retest reliability was strongly related to this backfire rate. I think one of the Marmite items was, again, that's a good example of an item where I don't think people really cared. It was definitely, I think it's this one. But yeah, it was incredibly interesting that reliability made such a difference. When it came to the more like theoretical mechanisms, here I'm just going to show you like essentially whether or not they were correlated. And here you have, experiment 1, experiment 2. Essentially, in terms of importance, we found no correlation at all. So the amount that people reported these attributes to be important, the stimuli to be important to themselves didn't make any difference with backfire rate. With their people's prior beliefs, remember here we're predicting people's strong beliefs to backfire more if it aligns with the worldview backfire effect theory. We did find in experiment 2 a significant finding. However, it's the wrong direction. So it's the people with the weakest, the weakest beliefs were backfiring more, not the strongest beliefs. Finally, when it came to familiarity related attributes, we found, again, particularly in experiment 2, that the more novel the stimuli, the more likely it was to backfire, as well as there was this strong relationship between illusory truth and backfire rate. However, we still wanted to kind of take this a step further. So we thought, well, this is, all of these there's some hope here. Maybe this is, let's kind of take it one step further and just ask ourselves, well, does it predict backfire rate above and beyond reliability? Essentially, for experiment 1, no. And for experiment 2, for novelty, we found that it explained an extra 6% of variance, but this is in contrast to 71% that reliability explained. And essentially for the question was, well, did illusory truth predict backfire rate above and beyond reliability? For experiment 1 and experiment 2, that was a big no. So essentially, in a big conclusion here is that measurement error may account for a substantial number of backfire effects. We have to keep in mind that there's 2 reasons reliability could be low. Either it's measurement error or people might not know where they stand on certain topics. However, this does mean that future research should certainly use reliable measures, report reliability of the measures, and take it into account for analyses. Also considering this could help give us more replicable findings, and also would be fantastic to be able to plan new studies based on these very reliable measures that some people have developed previously. Okay, let's check the time again. Good. So this is the final segment about discrediting disinformation sources. So this really came about by really noticing that these individuals peddling disinformation use the same kind of currency to develop their kind of a credible reputation, just the same as actual credible individuals. They say that they have a degree. They say that they've read or written many books. They say that they are a researcher. So I was really wondering, how do we steer people in the right direction, given the fact that there are so many people out there who are claiming expertise for their own personal gain, when in fact, obviously they're spreading disinformation. So this is brand new, by the way. This is also like not even a manuscript yet. This is like hot off the press. So essentially, this study was just trying to find out how people evaluate new misinformation that these sources are saying after they find out they have spread misinformation previously, or that they're actually not qualified at all to give accurate information. So this is a study with 300 participants. We first present a source that seems very credible. We say, Dr. Smith is a lecturer and researcher in oncology. All the stimuli for this experiment was based on cancer. We say their undergraduate degree was from Harvard, the PhD from Berkeley. They've got a New York Times bestseller, which has been published in many languages, cutting edge research. And this is incredibly typical of a disinformation source. Like we did quite a lot of reading of how they present themselves. We then either give a control condition, they like photography, they really like cooking, they have some siblings, I think they also enjoy running, or we present a condition where we highlight the low expertise, say they're actually not qualified to give medical advice or any advice regarding cancer treatment. We say that they're undergraduate from Harvard. It's amazing how many disinformation sources have undergraduate degrees from Harvard. Anyway, say they have degrees from Harvard. Yeah, we say that this was actually in English literature, their undergraduate, and their PhD was in anthropology. So they're actually not qualified. And then the final condition is correcting misinformation. So we highlight 4 statements that the source have made that are false. And essentially we measure belief in new misinformation, the evaluations of source credibility, and also feelings towards the source. We also give what's called like the complementary and alternative belief inventory, just to see how people's endorsement of complementary medicines and alternative medicines, I guess, interact with our findings. So what we find is here we have like endorsement or belief in new misinformation here, and in the control condition, of course, people are like, they sound great, I believe what they say. And when you both correct the misinformation and highlight that they don't have expertise, this both significantly reduces their belief in new misinformation, which is fantastic. And it actually reduces it the same amount. So it reduced for both of these interventions equally. What was very interesting is that belief in the new misinformation was correlated, highly correlated with these CAMB scores, the complementary and alternative medicine inventory. Now, when it comes to source credibility, again, but in this pre-test, just after they've heard how wonderful this individual is, everyone's rating the source really high. The control remains high. And then, interestingly, the low expertise condition reduces people's evaluations of source credibility more than correcting misinformation, which is incredibly interesting. There was again a finding where we found that if people rated high on these the CAMB, the complementary and alternative medicines inventory, they were less likely to reduce their source evaluations in these interventions. And finally, it was almost identical for feelings towards the individual, which is very interesting. Again, the low expertise did a better job at reducing people's feelings towards the source than the correcting misinformation. In conclusion, our 2 interventions, so correcting misinformation and highlighting low expertise, reduced belief in new misinformation equally. People with a high CAMB score were more likely to believe in the new misinformation. Source ratings and feelings were reduced more by the low expertise condition. And also people with a high CAMB score were less likely to reduce their source credibility and feelings post-intervention. So just wrapping up, where to from here? I'm so excited to continue along, like finding out why belief regression occurs. I think trying to find out how to encourage sustained belief change, very, very interesting. And I think there's a lot to do here, like interventions, exactly what are people forgetting, how can we encourage that to kind of stick. In terms of reliability and backfire effects, I'm not planning any backfire studies in the near future, but I'll certainly be kind of taking reliability into account in all future studies now that I know what a big deal it is in belief. And finally, with discrediting disinformation sources, I'm hoping to kind of see whether or not I can reduce belief in new misinformation even more. What if the source is incredibly dubious? What if they're breaking these trustworthiness norms even more? And also, what about combinations? Can you combine low expertise with misinformation, for example? So thank you very much also to my collaborators who helped me out. This is the collaborators who worked with me for memory and belief. And then my also collaborators for discrediting disinformation sources. And just also a quick plug that I'm hiring a new research assistant. If anyone knows any undergraduates who are finishing up this year interested in misinformation, please do have them email a cover letter and CV, and it's all on my website. And that's it. Thank you very much. I think I'm hopefully right on time.
All righty. Thanks so much. So now we will turn to Q&A. The first question is really just a request for that you list any books or articles on the topic that you've published. So you have that request. Okay.
A list.
A list, I suppose. And if you want to provide that to us, we can post it as well. So, or you can put it in the chat if you want to do.
Happy to.
Okay. Let me go to some.
What do you think they're referring to, the list that I presented on the slide, or just any list to do with?
This looks like it. I mean, would the author list any relevant books, including if she has published a book on the topic?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, especially with this belief regression stuff, like it is so brand new that it's only those papers that I mentioned there, and I'm definitely happy to share all of those.
Okay. All right. So the first question is about debunking with vehemence. Does it help to do fast, forthright takedown, or does that help cement the problem or the framing in the brain?
Correcting with what? Sorry, did you say?
Vehemence.
Oh. Fast takedown. Yeah, I think a lot. So we've done some research into kind of the different methods to correct, or different framing of a correction, and what what you should put first and how you should do it. Often I'm finding that it doesn't make that much of a difference. So the main thing in a correction is clarity, making sure that people really so they cannot miss that this thing is false and the reason why. So I don't even think a quick takedown versus a long takedown. Yeah, I think it's
okay. The next question: in the USA, tribalism seems to affect the willingness to correct misinformation. Have you studied that impact and the ability to correct misinformation? The examples: Republicans versus Democrats.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I actually came to America because I wanted to study misinformation in the context of misinformation. So I wrote, and that was literally like the grant I wrote for Fulbright in 2014 was, I was like, oh, the election will be interesting. So it was actually the political question that brought me here. We have found that people are surprisingly good, even strong people with, strong partisanship identity on both sides to update belief. However, that being said, people update belief incredibly well, even when it comes from, we did it with Trump and Sanders, and we found that even strong supporters of these individuals are willing to change their mind. However, it didn't change their feelings towards that individual or their likeliness to vote for them. So yeah, I think I still think it's very much worthwhile correcting and having a conversation with people from other ends of the partisanship spectrum. People do change their mind.
Okay. Did you attempt to account for trust in the reputable sources used in the corrections?
Funnily enough, we do have that. We did measure trust in the corrections in the disinformation source, but that is so fresh. I don't think we've even analyzed that yet. But traditionally, what we find is that, so in traditional source credibility literature, you can break source credibility into trustworthiness, how much individuals are willing to give you the correct information, versus this expertise, how much people are qualified to give you the correct information. And what people traditionally find is that trustworthiness does all the work. It is so important that people trust the source, or to far more than whether or not they consider them experts. So I think, yeah, it's always important to factor in trust, but I guess in the memory and belief work, we didn't really have proper sources. but we're definitely factoring trust into the discrediting disinformation sources one. I think it's important.
Okay, next, I wonder how much emotional memory / affective association influence the delayed belief return. As one, some topics have strong emotional association, hence more remembered, and two, fact checks tend to be, quote, emotionally dry, hence more forgotten. Have you investigated or you plan to investigate that influence as well?
Oh my gosh, I'd love to investigate that. I think emotion has such a strong impact here, and there are like people that dedicate their lives to just that interaction of emotion and memory. And I think when you have an emotive kind of piece of content, it certainly does improve memory. So yeah, I mean, not in the near future, but I would love to see that study done or do it myself, definitely.
Okay. Do we know if the misinformation and the correction are repeated in the same scale, which one would last?
If the correction and the misinformation, which one would last?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So we do know the effect size of correcting misinformation is far greater than the illusory truth effect, if that makes sense. So if you repeat both of them, you're still going to get a massive reduction of belief. So I guess it's like, I don't know, I think it's like really positive news for correcting misinformation, because just the plain repetition of misinformation or information in general can be vastly overtaken by a correction.
Okay. We're getting a serious backlog of questions here. Let's keep marching along. If people forget fact checks unless they're reinforced, is the best way to ensure fact checks stick just repeating them over certain periods of time? Is there any research into sustained community / trust building instead? Does it make a difference?
I think that comes back to the question of trust and how important it is. And I think without that element of trust, it's yeah, I think we're kind of lost in terms of the fact checking well. But oh gosh, what was the first part? I got
the first part of that question. If people forget fact checks unless they're reinforced, is the best way to ensure fact checks stick just repeating them over certain periods of time?
That is definitely one way. And I think that for a while now, I've been kind of encouraging fact checkers to repeat their fact checks, not only because different people will find different fact checks online, but it's also really helpful to have a recent kind of fact check out there. I think repetition is one of the best tools we have. And of course, we're dealing with probably people who aren't incredibly staunch and know exactly where they stand. They're probably not going to forget that you told them, on Wednesday that this was false. But it is such a helpful tool that I would recommend repetition. There's also a lot of research in like depth of encoding, making sure people are attending. I mean, how we do that on the online world, I think is like going to be the next kind of foray into this research.
Okay, here's just a clarification question. Did the test questions have don't know as an option?
Yes. In memory and belief, yes. So we had on the 0 to 10 scale, we explicitly told them that 5 meant unsure. I love the question of midpoints in terms of research, and I think that they have to be meaningful. I think that using that as unsure is like a good option. In the other studies, I think we have some. Yeah, I think in the others as well, you can create that. It was probably less explicit.
Does the backfire effect regress over time?
Oh gosh, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've measured backfire effects over time. I certainly have the data to look into that. I would think because reliability is so far the main driver, I would expect it to increase over time because as time passes, things get more and more unreliable because people forget where they stand. If you ask them like a half an hour later, people are kind of more likely to think, oh, I said that it was a 3 before. So yeah, I would expect it to increase.
Okay. Any concrete advice for fact checkers? I'm guessing journos means journalists, to consider when wording headlines / social media posts with corrections to minimize the backfire effect?
Absolutely. So the key here is always putting what we're calling that false tag, like always putting that in the headline. You don't want to just give people an opportunity to skim past a headline and think what you're saying is true. This needs to be front and center, and have that very much a part of the headline. Essentially, it's all about saliency. Yeah, you don't want them to have any option to skim past it and think that what you're saying is true or misinterpret.
Okay. Do beliefs about source credibility regress over time?
Yeah.
I'm detecting a theme
I
here.
love it. I think all these questions should be answered.
Yeah.
I have no idea, especially for the latter one. I mean, that kind of line of research is so fresh. I'd love to answer all these questions. Yeah, I'd love a delay there. I think it could be very interesting, because how people cobble together an idea of a source does change over time, I would presume. Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever thought about using visuals for correction interventions to sustain memory?
For sure. Yeah, I think that could be a big one, because we know that could be that there's a lot of memory tricks out there that we could, and I would expect it to be visuals to be also more attention grabbing. I think often it's not just how you encode information, but what actually grabs your attention. So I would expect visuals, I don't know, maybe flashing. There's so many things you could do.
Okay. All right. Is it that ad hominem attacks and authority of the source of misinformation are more effective because people remember the dichotomy of friend versus foe of the source better than true versus false character of the statement?
Yeah, I don't know. I think people are pretty good at not just kind of dichotomizing friend versus foe. I think there's a lot. I mean, that being said, I think it takes a lot of time and energy and cognitive resources to look into an individual's credibility. So I think a lot of the time you are going off heuristics. You are making these mental shortcuts into like judging sources. And I think this is what's so scary about some of these disinformation sources, particularly in the health space, is that they are incredibly good at cobbling together. Like I've seen sources who they are an editorial member on a predatory journal. They publish in predatory journals. They have an astounding H index. They say that they went to all these universities. We can never know or check. And they really present as these legitimate scientists, which is just, if you're not like digging into this, you almost have to take up a day to find that some people aren't an expert in these areas. So I think, yeah, maybe people do just like make these snap judgments, and I definitely think there's some shortcuts going on. But
okay, do you have any insights on complexity based on research where the different bias / belief formation is poor because of external demands and time compression, or too complex for cursory overview?
yeah, I think unfortunately we're still like literally right at the beginning of this research, so I think that's probably a future directions topic. I just think I don't have my slide that I normally present. Actually, I normally present it to like policymakers, of my slide of a baby trying to do science, because we're just so fresh, and this whole field is in its infancy. I mean, especially the belief regression stuff. So I think like maybe in 10 papers time we'll know the answer to these.
So the next question is asking about advice you give to the media based on your research. Is there anything more you want to say beyond the
media? Oh yeah. I mean, there's so many things that the media can do. Providing citations would be great to like, primary resources all the time. Would be super. Even like tips for like correcting information would be, instead of like just retracting the misinformation, retracting the misinformation and presenting an alternative, what we call a factual alternative, to switch out the misinformation for the factual information. I think that's one thing that is often highly effective. Present detail is always good.
Okay. With distrust in institutions so high, who or what should be responsible in correcting mis and disinformation?
Yeah, that's a really good one, because I do think it has to be like different communities trust different individuals. So I think that can be really tough. The thing I've been really surprised at is that trust in science and scientists in the medical community remain so incredibly high. And I think that's really positive. And, we can certainly use that given their, if they're still so trusted, I think they're a good candidates to be presenting corrective information. But I really do think like a trusted source can be literally anyone. It could be, your uncle or, whoever. So I think like, there's almost a little bit of responsibility for everyone, for their various communities to be good correctors.
Does the experience of intellectual humility have an impact on belief persistence or regression?
Oh, that's such a good question. So for those of you who don't know, intellectual humility is like a scale of how willing you are to change your mind. And there's some great questions in there. I've found that there's a lot of I once looked at partisanship with intellectual humility, and Republicans reported to be less likely to change their mind. But when I actually looked at the belief change, they changed their mind just fine. They changed it as much as Democrats. So I think it's actually a really interesting question, almost this like subjective viewpoint of yourself to be like, well, will I change my mind in accordance to new evidence versus the actual fact and the reality? And those can be, this kind of subjective and objective can be two very, very different things. I also think people change their mind so much that it can be hard to measure. So I'd love to get some items that are harder to change, and then we can see whether intellectual humility is making a big difference.
Okay. Do you have any policy recommendations or implications that come to mind from your work regarding how governments should respond or counter disinformation?
I think from what I've seen, just using simple language, retracting it simply, again, being very clear. I have seen some, I wish I'd actually just collected them. I have seen some really bad examples of misinformation correction during the pandemic. And I think it's often when it becomes far too complicated, far too many things going on. I think the simple messages, because like people need to know what is false very, very clearly. But also, I think that's a very kind of different topic than, for example, maybe trying to help educate the public in terms of how things change or what we don't know. I think, there was a lot of backlash about, when mask mandate recommendations changed, and a lot of people were like, haha, scientists don't know anything either. Or, I think that, helping educate people as, things change over time and it's not necessarily a correction. But yeah, I think simplicity is key. Okay.
Unfortunately, we have hit the 1 o'clock hour, so we're going to have to end there. But I want to take the opportunity one more time to thank Professor Briony Swire-Thompson for a really terrific presentation and responding to a tremendous number of questions, which covered about 1/3 of what we actually had. Just
awesome.
Awesome. So thank you so much.
Welcome. It's great to be here.
Bye-bye.